The evidence that I've looked at would indicate that broadly, the average value to the people living in those trophy hunting zones, the communities, between about 70 cents and $4 a year.
Well, Travers, it's lovely to have you. Thank you so much for
It's
being with us
great
today.
pleasure to be with you, Charles and Sophie.
Yeah, we try and start at the beginning with this thing. So let's start at the beginning of your own journey.
Very good place to start.
It is.
Stop it.
Let's not go into musical theatre this early in the podcast.
I know. And song as well.
Yeah.
Well, super briefly, my family from various parts of the world, mum partly French, grandmother more than partly French. My dad's family from the north of England, from Newcastle and from Jesmond in particular. And I came along in 1958. I know, you can say nice things.
Yeah,
now.
no, I know.
Impossible.
I can't believe it.
How impossible.
Yeah, it is impossible.
1958. And I guess the first sort of big thing was going to Africa with my folks. We went out on a steamship, old-fashioned, old school. Went out on a thing called the Kenya Castle, which is part of Union Line, through the Suez Canal. Took 3 weeks. And Bay of Biscay, I actually even remember the Bay of Biscay because it was so rough. It was extraordinary.
Were you ill?
No, I wasn't ill at all.
Okay.
I stood. There was my sister, my little brother, who was really little at the time, myself, mum and dad, and a nanny who was looking after us. And I remember standing on the highest deck of this enormous 3-funnel liner, and still the spray was coming up and lashing us as we crashed through the Bay of Biscay, then through the Suez Canal, and then to Port of Mombasa in Kenya. Got the night train. The night train at that time was very slow, so it took all night. Clue in the name, I think. And but it goes through a national park.
Right. Okay.
And it goes through a huge national park. So it's for hours it's going through a national park. Tsavo National Park, east and west, is 20,000 square kilometres, still is today. So that's the size of Wales. And full of wildlife. And even at that young age, I think I knew I was on some massive adventure.
How old were you again, sorry, Will?
I was 5.
Oh.
And I had my 6th birthday in Kenya. And we went to where the film was being made, and we lived in a really lovely old house, and we had some fantastic people looking after us. We had a cook who made fantastic curry. I was a big fan of curry at the age of 5. And there was a driver who looked after us and took us everywhere when we needed to get somewhere. And that was it. Mum and Dad were away making the movie, and we were there for 10 months getting some schooling and riding horses and playing with a dog and just falling in love with wildlife in Africa and the people.
So it was quite a long shoot then.
Oh, you wouldn't. You couldn't do it nowadays.
No.
You couldn't afford it.
No.
And I suppose nowadays they would have used, CGI and all the rest of it, all the gimmicks. But that didn't even exist. I mean, remember, everybody, this was before we had the internet. Email was what?
Well,
email was what the postman said when he turned up. Hey, let's get some email.
And you filmed on film as well.
It was filmed on proper film. We were rushes being sent away and developed and looked at and checked. The old hair in the gate. Check there's no hair in the gate.
That's why they say checking the gate. I have never put 2 and 2 together and
checking the gate.
Interesting. Okay.
Whole sequence lost because there's something flickering. And but it was truly extraordinary. And we went down as a family, as the children, to the set, but where the animals were once. And I think Mum and Dad could tell that small children around large predators is not good for either. We don't know what we're doing, and we're too quick and too hasty in our movements. And the predators react to that. Predators are hardwired and soft-wired. You just don't want to get the hardwired bit because that's automatic hunting behavior. and a lion will go over a 10-foot fence with a goat in its mouth. So, we are a target. So we never went down again. But the whole experience, and then at the end of filming, there was 2 weeks when we went on safari and traveled around and just absorbed, the non-work side of being in Africa, in Kenya.
Yeah.
And it was amazing.
What an experience. It's funny, I actually never knew that about you, Will, that you were there when Born Free was being filmed. I mean, I've always, perhaps now is a good time to sort of start at the inception of the Born Free Foundation, and perhaps talk a little bit about Pole Pole and everything that went on there, because it's a really emotional story, and I think it's
sure. So I mean, a lot of people do think that Born Free, the charity, began because of Mum and Dad working on Born Free with Lions. George Adamson was the technical advisor on the film. He was with them every single day. Everything that we informally as non-scientists learned about lions, or Mum and Dad did, and they passed it on, came from George.
Okay.
But then when filming was over, it had been such a profound experience that my dad in particular said, I really, he did a bit more acting. He was in things like, he was in a film called Duel at Diablo, a Western.
Okay.
With Sidney Poitier and James Garner and Dennis Weaver, B.B. Anderson. It's a fairly gritty Western, and he had a terrible riding accident in it and completely smashed his leg and his shoulder and was taken to hospital, flown to hospital in Frank Sinatra's private jet, which apparently blew up the next day. Anyway, leaving that aside, when the movie was over, he started to make wildlife documentary films. And the first film he made was what happened to the lions that were used in the film Born Free, because there were 20 lions used in that film, different age cohorts and the rest of it. And only 3 of them did Mum and Dad and George and Joy manage to kind of rescue from going into a life of long-term captivity. I mean, I think their view was that life should mirror art. And if the film tells a story of freedom, it seems just fundamentally wrong that the lions would end up in a lifetime of captivity. And unfortunately, many of them did. But the 3 that didn't went with George to Meru National Park and were eventually successfully released back into the wild. And he made a documentary called The Lions Are Free about that story. And I think he got that non-acting, documentary-making bug right then and there. And he went on to make a series of documentaries, Christian the Lion. He made films with Oxford Scientific Films about the sex life of flowers. Death Trap with Vincent Price came over and did a little piece to camera, a cameo, narrating a film about insects.
Wow.
And yeah, it's amazing, absolutely amazing sort of series of opportunities. And I was involved in a few of them, including one called The Queen's Garden, which was a year in the life of the garden at Buckingham Palace. And they had pretty much unfettered access to the garden for 12 months, including Her Majesty, her late Majesty, making a small appearance and coming in and just walking through the garden with the corgis and talking to the head gardener and stuff like that. And it sort of tells you how times have changed. I'm sorry, I'm digressing. You can always cut this bit out. I'm digressing because in those days, you think of security nowadays, we've become paranoid. In those days, I was given a piece of paper which said, go to K-Gate, knock on the door and present this bit of paper. So I knocked on the door. I had a huge box with a tripod, huge tripod in it. And a policeman opens the door and he says, oh, yes. And you just walk in. I walked into Buckingham Palace, up through to the top level, and then climbed onto the roof with the camera crew and set up a tripod with cameras and stuff to film the garden party from the roof.
Wow.
We had 2 or 3 cameras on it. I just can't imagine.
No. Did they check inside the box?
No.
So it could have literally been a gun.
I could have been setting up.
Let
us not go there. But I mean, seriously, it could have been.
Wow,
I had a Gatling gun. No, I couldn't. But you know what I mean? It
That's
just
crazy.
feels like a whole different era and a much
It really is.
gentler time.
Oh, yeah. I went to Houses of Parliament recently and had to go through like airport security to go in and everything. And this guy's like, he didn't even say, get off your phone. He just pointed at a sign in silence that said, phone off. I was like, sorry. So
yeah. Anyway,
crazy.
there was a meeting I went to fairly recently where, you know, all my information for this meeting, which was with the EU, was on my tablet, and the sign said no tablets.
Oh, no.
And you say, how do you function? And they said it's
yeah.
not easy, but you're not allowed to. So anyway, but one of the things that Dad did after Born Free was he made a feature film called An Elephant Called Slowly, which was a light-hearted, nature-based, you know, wildlife-based comedy about my mum and dad going to look after a house in Kenya while the owner is having surgery in Switzerland. I mean, a fairly preposterous conceit, but fine. And the little note that goes with the here are the keys was it's full of characters, and they go, oh, he must mean full of character, but no, it's full of characters because there's 3 elephants that live around the house, eat all the flowers and the rest of it. One of the animal actors in that was a little elephant, and her name was Poli Poli, which means slowly in Swahili. So the star really of the film. And they had come across her in a trapper's yard in Nairobi. There's a guy called John Seago who had caught her on behalf of the Kenya government of the day as a gift to the London Zoo. And so effectively the film waylaid her for about 6 to 8 weeks. And at the end of filming, this terrified little elephant had become, you know, putty in their hands. I mean, she wanted to roll in the mud together. They wanted to go walks together, hand fed, cuddled, reassured, because of course she'd been taken live from her family. And this human couple quickly became her family. And the government said, look, if you want her, you can have her, but we will go and catch another baby elephant. And my mum in particular just said, no way, no way. It's putting another elephant family through that trauma and stress, and it's just not acceptable. So Poli Poli went to London Zoo, and I think intentionally, my parents said, we're not going to visit her because we can't have the relationship we had before. She's got to create the relationship with the keeping staff and with others because we can't go in and give her a cuddle. I mean, we'll be almost like forbidden fruit. We'll be outside calling her name, waving. She'll know us, and then she'll wonder why we can't have a cuddle. So we sort of severed relations until we heard from Daphne Sheldrick, the late great Daphne Sheldrick, that Poli Poli was in trouble, that she'd become really difficult to manage. There was a chance she would be destroyed. And so we went to take a look. And there is an amazing photograph of Virginia and Bill stretching their hands out across the moat of the Elephant House at London Zoo, which I have to say is one of the least attractive buildings I've ever encountered. And Poli Poli's reaching her trunk out from the other side to sort of touch straining fingers. And so we said at the time, could she not go somewhere else, go to the wild? And we actually found a place in southern Africa, in Bafuthatswana, that would have taken her. The zoo said no. And after a lot of to and fro, they said, okay, we'll move her to Whipsnade, where she won't be on her own, because she'd been on her own in London Zoo. There are other elephants, and the enclosure has grass. Novelty, of course, because there's no grass in the Elephant House at London Zoo. But when they tried to move her, the move was unsuccessful. She damaged a foot. She was standing in her crate. There's actually a really incredible photograph of, I think it was a member of the sappers or somebody, Royal Engineers, trying to jack her up because she'd collapsed. She has a steel hawse around her neck, and there's a trolley jack under her arse to try and lift her up. Anyway, she damaged a foot. They examined her under anaesthetic. she didn't respond afterwards. They said she'd lost the will to live, and they euthanized her in the elephant house. And this had been news, her plight had been news, but her death was front page. A lot of people just said, well, is that it? Was it a cry for help campaign, or is there something more profound that's going on? And we sort of struggled with it, but for not very long, and came to the conclusion that zoos shouldn't be self-policing, and that the very, very new legislation that had come in called the Zoo Licensing Act was probably not fit for purpose. And there was plenty of room for a small ginger group, we weren't even a charity at that time, to just prod the system. So we set up this thing called Zoo Check, both to check on zoos and also, check as in stop, at least stop further expansion. There are hundreds of zoos in the UK. And I remember the then director of the London Zoo, David Jones, said, it'll be a 9-day wonder. What do they know? What do they know? We are the professionals. And we just celebrated our 40th anniversary. And yes, we're still going. And yes, we're still focused on zoos. Zoos very, very central to the issue. And I think I can bring this right up to date. We can, of course, travel round and go backwards. But to bring it right up to date, this day, the day we are recording this, there's been a report in the Times about an investigation carried out by a zoo into the regulations that zoos are required to commit themselves to if they are members of the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria. That's kind of the top zoos club. And this investigation reveals hundreds, if not thousands, of deficiencies in terms of this application of the standards. Here is the Times, Friday, May 17th. So whether this is a few days later or not that you're watching this. And here's a really big and important story. This is about what's going on in European Association of Zoos, accredited zoos. So this is the top club for zoos in Europe. It's about 300 zoos out of the 3,000 zoos in Europe. And this is a report, an investigation that's been done not by Born Free, it's been done by the Aspinall Foundation. Damien Aspinall owns 2 zoos, 2 really big zoos. And he is profoundly disenchanted with the entire concept. In fact, I think he thinks that he's kind of wasted the last 40 years. He's misdirected the last 40 years of his life. This is not the future. This is the past. And if the top club for the best zoos in Europe can't even get their own zoos to meet their own standards, what does that say? For me, it's about trust. It really is about trust. And I think I even said it somewhere in this article when responding to it, I said, it is about trust. How can the public trust a zoo that says EASA accredited if EASA can't even enforce its own regulations? Breakdown of trust, very hard to reverse.
I'm going to take a picture of that, Will, and I'm going to post it so that people can see the article as well, because I can just see from what you were holding up, there's some really heartbreaking images on there, especially that elephant. Is that baby elephant?
Yeah, there's an elephant up there as well. But we're talking about, here's this little bit here. A zoo in Hungary called Sosto had the highest number of reported breaches of these accreditation guidelines, 418 breaches. And it is run, get this, by the chairman of EASA.
No.
I rest my case, my lord.
Wow. It truly is marking your own homework there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why I find that fascinating is because it's not Born Free saying it.
Right.
If it was Born Free saying it, the zoo world would turn around and go, yeah, well, we know what they think. They've at least been consistent for the last 40 years. But the fact that it's a major zoo that is calling into question not just the standards and their application, but the entire validity and rationale for having zoos in the first place, shows to me at least, how far that conversation has moved and how much the questioning, inquiring minds have come to recognize our position and to begin to doubt the trust that we put in zoos.
It's amazing. And, 40 years it sounds like a long time, but it's, it's not that long really in the grand scheme of things to make such huge impact in the world of conservation and wildlife and stuff like that.
Well, the thing is, with just focusing on zoos, the thing that I think is fascinating is that you're right. 40 years, of course, is a lifetime's work. I am about to get my state pension. But if you think that zoos in one form or another have been around for a very, very long time, sort of private menageries of Roman emperors were the first zoos,
Right.
the Greeks, Roman emperors, and the Egyptians, and the Chinese. And then you go through the sort of, you go right through the Victorian era. There was a polar bear that was kept at the Tower of London for a while. You go through all of that, and then you hit the first sort of, quote, modern zoo, which is disputed to be either Vienna or London. But that's in the 1820s, around the 1820s. So we are now, I like to call it, 200 years into the zoo experiment in its modern form. And if you have an experiment that lasts 200 years, what you should be able to do is to demonstrate pretty profoundly how successful you've been or not. And I would argue that it's more not. And therefore, to continue with the zoo experiment for another 100 years and another millions of animals in captivity and billions of pounds spent on it, when the natural world is crying out for help, to think that zoos are the answer, or even just a significant player in bringing that help, is, I think, a fantasy.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that, because zoos, we were talking about this in the car yesterday, weren't we? Giles has got children, lots of people around the country that have young kids, and they like, well, yeah, but zoos are a good way of connecting people with animals. And I went to zoos when I was a kid, and back in the day, before we really knew much about how bad it was just a nice way to see animals. But what is the truth about zoos? Like, is there a good way, like a quote unquote good way of doing zoos, or should it be no zoos ever?
Well, of course, there are consequences to any wish list like that. I would say that we need to turn the supertank around, and we need to bring the sort of sense of zoological gardens, collections of animals on public display to the general public with questionable conservation benefits, highly questionable educational benefits. We need to bring that to an end. That doesn't mean that there should be a void afterwards. And the void is already being filled in all sorts of interesting and exciting ways, a lot of them technologically driven. The whole sort of augmented reality world that we are getting into, the metaverse, and those things will become an opportunity, I believe, for largely urban Western societies, at least, to engage with wildlife that they would not normally see. In other words, exotic wildlife. But we mustn't forget, there's hundreds, I believe there's 3,000 nature reserves across the United Kingdom of varying sizes. That's our nature. That's where we should be taking our kids. And I talked to someone the other day, and they said, not dissimilarly from what you've just suggested, they said, well, I take my kids to the zoo and we look at the animal, and then I explain about the animal and what's going on with it in the wild and the problems that it faces and the conservation challenges and the conflict with human beings. And I said, so you are the lens through which your children understand nature, not the animal in the cage. In fact, what you're doing is you're trying to disassociate the animal in the cage from the true story of that species, that animal in the wild, and you're trying to steer your kids. So they're the lucky kids. I mean, seriously, how brilliant to have a dad or a mum who can help interpret this. I just don't think it's right, correct, proper, appropriate, acceptable, ethical to keep wild animals in captivity for such terribly modest returns. And anyone who says, well, their sacrifice is for the greater good. I say, well, you wouldn't apply that, and you shouldn't apply that to human beings. Why are you applying it to animals?
Yeah, I mean, the only time that we do that with humans is when we send people to prison for doing terrible things, and even sometimes those sorts of things are quite questionable. So it's crazy that you just snap up an animal from its natural environment and put it in a cage for entertainment, not even
and for the rest of its life. And to be fair, lots of animals are now bred in captivity. They're not necessarily, not entirely true. Still lots of elephants caught from the wild and put into zoos in China and in the Middle East, for example. But even the notion that, and it's used as an excuse, the zoological community will turn around and say, well, but it's born in captivity, it knows nothing else. Well, that immediately denies millions of years of innate evolution and the behavioral needs of an animal in the context of a wild environment, which it has evolved to live in. And you put it in an artificial, you put it on its own in an artificial environment in the middle of Birmingham or Bedfordshire or Blackpool, and you claim that that delivers truly educational outcomes or conservation outcomes. I beg to differ most strongly.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the conservation aspect of it, because again, this is another thing I hear people say, like, but zoos, they have like conservation benefits, right? And do they, first of all? Like, is that true? Is that like a justification for zoos, or do zoos do good things for conservation?
Do zoos do good things?
I'm such a good podcast
no, it's such
question
a great
answer.
question. It would be really foolish to say that no species has benefited at all from any kind of captive breeding program. I mean, that would be naive, and I would be beaten into a corner by it if I presented that as my argument. However, the number of species that have been conserved, as I define it, at least, through captive breeding in zoos is fleetingly small. And by conserved, I mean bred in captivity, returned to their natural habitat, where they become self-sufficient and self-perpetuating. So they can look after themselves, and then they can have offspring, and they can begin to rebuild a population. That sounds to me like conservation. Anything else is more preservation. It's like, yes, we can keep this animal alive, we can breed it in captivity, but if it's going nowhere, then that whole notion is also going nowhere. So the number of species that that meet my criteria in zoos since the Second World War, probably less than 50, probably
Really?
less than 20.
That is crazy.
To be honest.
So in all of that time, since the Second World War,
70 years.
there's
80 years.
like what, one animal every couple of years, maybe?
One species. And there are all sorts of challenges that those species, those animals, those individuals are confronted with. So a good example, which sort of ultimately had some success, but a good example of just how difficult it is. So you breed a species in captivity over multiple generations. Let's take the golden lion tamarin. It's a small primate that lives in the coastal rainforests of Brazil. Bred in captivity over multiple generations, they then took a cohort of them back to the wild, reintroduced them, and they couldn't understand why they kept finding them dead. And the reason they kept finding them dead was because in captivity, the enclosures they had were furnished with immovable objects. So branches that the animal would grab and then move on to the next branch. In the wild, they grab a branch and it whips, or it moves, or they slide down it because it's flexible, and they would fall. They would fall hundreds of feet to the ground and die. So, of course, they adapted the methodology to make sure that the enclosures in captivity were more similar. I mean, it's not rocket science. You have to make your captive enclosure as near the wild as possible in order to prepare animals for the wild, you'd have thought. And I remember a figure that came out of that, which was that the cost per animal of reintroduction, remember, this is something not as big as a small house cat, was $189,000 per animal.
Wow.
And so I do a sort of slightly back of a fag packet analysis, and I say the wild is crying out for money.
Yeah.
Protecting wildlife is extremely challenging and expensive and complex and diverse, and nowadays in particular with sort of growing human population in so many wild areas, the conflict is there, the land conversion is there, illegal wildlife trade is there. All of these things have to be taken into account. But when you are spending, as for example, in the last, and I think I've got this figure right, in the last 20 years, the world's top zoos have spent more than $1 billion on elephant enclosures alone. And I look at the Kenya Wildlife Service in Kenya, my friends at KWS, who I've worked with now for a long time, 30-something years, and I know that their operating budget a year for everything they do is around $60 million. That's to look after 6 million acres of land, 35,000 elephants, 2,500 lions, 2,000 rhino, etc., etc., and all the species that live in those protected habitats that we don't even talk about because they're not the charismatic animals that we can easily relate to because they're in our childhood reader book.
The big five.
B is for bear, and D is for dog, and E is for elephant. Guess what? And T is for tiger, and L is for lion. We all learn that. So it's not those species. It's all the other little creatures, or the less dramatic creatures that share those large landscape level habitats. All of that is in desperate need of resources, and to spend 10, 20, 30, in the case of the Los Angeles Zoo in America, who completed a new elephant enclosure in 2012, $42 million on a 3-acre elephant enclosure, which had 4 elephants, 2 of which are now dead, and it's only a female and Billy, the psychotic male elephant, left. I don't get it. I don't get it. And I don't understand why people think that that's an ooh-ah moment.
Well, I wonder if it is because I'm just thinking from, the perspective of the sort of people that go to zoos. You're just, normal people, right? They want to go out and see animals and perhaps people that can't go on safari, and safaris are very expensive. And, if you want to see an animal like a lion or a baboon in the wild, you have to pay a lot of money to do that. And I'm just thinking from the perspective of these people, it's kind of like, well, it's worth it because we get to see these animals, sort of thing. And it, if you spend all that money on animals in Africa, well, we're never going to get to see the benefit of that. Like, there's a sort of disconnect. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do. I understand that. I think it slightly unravels that argument for a couple of reasons. The first one is the sort of moral and philosophical one, which is just because we can doesn't mean we should.
Right.
And we can do anything. We put a human being on the moon. Sorry to any conspiracy theorists watching, but we did put a man on the moon.
We'll put this out on Facebook and on Instagram. It'll get loads of conspiracy theories.
50 years ago, technology allowed us to do that. We can do almost anything that we want from a technological point of view. But we also can understand the reason why we don't need to incarcerate wildlife in order to appreciate it. So one of the biggest growth areas in wildlife tourism in the world is whale watching.
Interesting.
But millions, billions of people sign up to protect whales knowing they'll never go and see a whale in the wild. They can buy into the concept that whales shouldn't be in captivity, shouldn't be shot for pet food, shouldn't be turned into soap. They buy into that knowing that they will never see a whale in the wild. So we need to re-educate ourselves and our expectations. not everyone will see the Great Wall of China. Not everyone will see the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Not everyone will see the Great Barrier Reef. And not everyone will see the Serengeti migration. That's just life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, having understood that, let's work creatively together to give people meaning, to create for people meaningful, exciting, dynamic, interactive wildlife experiences that are not based on the potential suffering of individual wild animals in captivity.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that. Lovely.
I mean, leading on from that, I mean, obviously, something that Sophie and I have delved into more recently is ecotourism, and we're obviously seeing places taking a stand to help the way we experience animals in the wild. And some people are doing it right, and some people are maybe not doing it quite so right. Is there a precedent for that sort of thing to increase if we were to phase out animals in captivity, and actually, we're seeing kind of some animal behaviors changing because of us going and spending lots of time with them in their environments. What can we be doing better around that kind of stuff?
It's a good point. I mean, take Rwanda, for example. The biggest foreign currency earner for Rwanda, that tiny little landlocked country in East Africa, is two foreign currency earners. One is coffee and one is guerrilla tourism. The guerrilla tourism is based on really small numbers of people paying really large amounts of money to spend very little time with wild gorillas, habituated wild gorillas. So these are gorillas who have come to understand that humans are not a threat. They're not somebody to be afraid of. And therefore they can carry on their lives comfortably as long as we behave respectfully to them. I think there's lots of scope. Whale watching, I've already mentioned. Another way of making an honest living by observing and interacting, but in a very controlled way with wildlife. I think there's lots of opportunities for that, and best practice guidance, and if necessary, government regulation needs to step in. Where you see it going wrong is when you have wildlife situations. I can think of several in East Africa where there is no control on the number of tourists that can enter a particular space at any one time. And I think that people listening or watching this will have seen photographs of, cheetahs or lions in various places, Ngorongoro Crater, the Masai Mara, surrounded by more vehicles than you can count. The same with the migration. You when you focus on the wildebeest crossing the river, when you pull back, and what you'll see is not quite, but almost as many 4x4s along the river edge, watching the spectacle. That isn't right either. So there needs to be a balance, and of course, tourism brings with it, I think, lots of benefits, but it also has some real disbenefits. So tourists and tourist lodges use an inordinate amount of water, often in really water impoverished environments. That's an issue. Tourist vehicles, in order to get that once in a lifetime shot, will go off road. It's a fragile environment. It can take decades to recover. And if that's happening all the time, it will never recover. Litter's an issue. Batteries that are disposed of. There was an elephant that I remember dying because it went to a rubbish pit and ate batteries and died. There's all sorts of challenges, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for that best practice, recognizing that, for example, in Kenya, the number of people involved in the tourism industry, which is predominantly wildlife-based tourism. Yes, there's beach safaris, beach holidays as well, but it's about 1.5 million people's livelihoods are dependent on tourism. In the big picture scenario, when we talk about climate change and global warming and carbon and everything else, there's a tough decision to be taken, or there's a tough argument to be made for saying that we need to scale back on tourism because of wider climate impacts. But at the same time, we've got to work out, how do we not lose the benefits that those the livelihoods, not just benefits, the livelihoods. And remember, in many parts of the world, for every person who's got a job, there are 8, 10 dependents, because jobs are hard to come by. Jobs are difficult to come by. So that's important, really important to understand. I could take it into a slightly different area, which is, let talk about other benefits from wildlife, or so-called benefits from wildlife, like trophy hunting. So a study that I saw recently looked at the employment of people associated with trophy hunting in 8 African countries. Now, remember, I've just said that in Kenya, about 1.5 million, even if only half of them are involved in the wildlife sector, that's still 750,000 people employed by the wildlife sector. These 8 countries who practice trophy hunting, they account for about 58,000 jobs. It's a tiny number, and they're often poorly paid, seasonal. So these are people who'll be trackers, skinners. They'll carry people's luggage. They'll be looking after you at the bar in the facility that you're staying in. They're not the managers, the owners. They're not the people who are actually making the money from this. And then you could argue, well, yes, but through a combination of trophy fees and concession fees and everything else, local communities get a trickle-down benefit. The evidence that I've looked at, and this is published by the African Leadership University in 2021, would indicate that broadly, the average value to the people living in those trophy hunting zones, the communities, between about 70 cents and $4 a year.
Wow.
Okay, in a ridiculous world, I could try and argue that I wouldn't want to remove $4 a year from somebody. But in a real world, I'd say we have got to be able to do better than that. And trophy hunting as well. I know I'm going off and on about trophy hunting, but trophy hunting also, if you think about what the construct is, you have largely white Western male elites coming into areas and paying huge amounts of money, individually, 20, 40, 60, 80,000 US dollars for the privilege of killing an animal and taking the trophy home. But what they say to that community is, you look after that area so I can come and hunt in it. That feels, number one, really colonial and incredibly patronizing. But secondly, it denies, if you say to those people, that area is for trophy hunting, you employ the rangers with some of the money that comes from this process, but don't let any other activities happen in that area, you're denying those communities the opportunity to develop and choose and have choice and have agency over their lives, the lives of their children, the lives of their communities, and what they do with what is their land. It's a kind of, I use this expression when I talk about flower farms, it's a kind of economic slavery.
Yeah.
Because what it does is it's too much to turn down, but not enough to do anything with. The amount of money is like, okay, if you're going to pay me as a flower picker $3 a day to pick flowers, okay. But that $1,000 a year, what does that do in terms of putting your kids through secondary school, which you have to pay for? Will any of them ever even dream of going to university? Will they have a job that is not picking flowers?
And I also hear this argument as well on Twitter, for example, which is my least favorite for stuff like this, because you get sorry X. I will always be Twitter to me.
Yes,
You see these pictures pop up and it's like, let's face it, usually an American holding like an elephant's neck, and so it's the only thing really that I see on social media that gets my blood boiling, because I'm not really that emotionally triggered by a lot of the other stuff that people get upset about, like politics and stuff like that, but the animal stuff really gets to me. And I see a lot of people argue that oh well, it's good for conservation. I'm hunting for conservation purposes, essentially. Could you speak a little bit on that?
Well, it's it's a line that has been developed in such a way as to excuse the practice. You know, if I say I'm going out, I'm saving up my money to go out to Africa to shoot a lion because it's the nearest thing to an orgasm I'm ever likely to get, which I have on record.
Oh,
Okay.
someone said that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, God.
Absolutely.
Ugh.
Then you that's not an acceptable narrative. That, you know, the public at large are going to go, oh, what are you, some crazy guy? If you say, yes, but listen, when I go out, yes, I kill the elephant, but then the community gets the meat and I employ 5 people who are going to help track, and they're going to carry the tusks, and they're going to serve me my food and the rest of it. And then my huge fee that I pay, which is often a huge fee, is going to go, some of it's going to go to government, national, some of it's going to go to local community government, some of it's going to go to the local community. You can spin a very attractive, but I don't think entirely accurate web around your activity to make it more palatable, to make it more understandable, and also, importantly, to remove the person who's listening to the story from the core of it, which is you're finding pleasure and fun in taking the life of an animal. It's not because you want to feed your family. It's not subsistence hunting. It's not farming. It's not ranching. And it's trophy hunting. So there was a comment made not that long ago by a prominent member of society here, who said, you know, the animals that are shot tend to be the old and the weak and the infirm and the decrepit, and they're kind of past it. They're no longer breeding. They're going to die anyway soon. No, the animal that a hunter wants to shoot is the most magnificent, the one with the biggest mane, the biggest tusks, the biggest boss. That's the horns of a buffalo is called the boss. That's what a trophy is. And then you have organizations like Safari Club International in America, which have awards for the most animals shot, the most species shot, the most killing on most continents of thing, and the most novel means of killing. So you can use a muzzle loader, something that went out with the American Civil War. You can use a bow and arrow. You can use crossbow. You can even have people who have tried. There's a lady, I think she succeeded. She's the only person that I can think of who went into an elephant herd and stabbed an elephant to death.
Oh,
and the
God.
awards, they are rewarded, recognized, lauded for that achievement. There are psychological problems for these people, I think.
Well, I was going to say, if often with serial killers, they start by killing animals in childhood, right? If you're in England or in America and you kill a cat or a dog, you're probably a psychopath. But you go out to Africa and you kill a lion, you can't come home and be like, I just needed to kill an animal. And especially, I see people killing like giraffes, like these beautiful animals that are doing nothing to hurt anybody. A giraffe would never charge you or try and attack you or anything like that. It's so innocent and
There
pure.
is something very psychologically disturbing. I don't know if you remember, there was a restaurant critic in the UK who's passed on now. His name was A.A. Gill. And A.A. Gill, to the best of my recollection, went on a trophy hunting safari and shot a baboon. And
Yes.
in his report of how he felt, he said, that's the closest I'll ever get to killing a human being. The feeling of killing a human being. And you just go, why would you? Why on earth would you want to even get close to that experience? What is the matter with you?
Psychopath.
Yeah,
That's what it is.
It is extraordinary.
But again, you see the people that are sort of like, well, it's because it's in it's human nature because especially men. You hear men that are sort of like, well,
So you can't. So what are they saying? I can't control human nature.
well, it's like there's this carnal thing, anthropologically speaking, I guess they're sort of like, this is what we do, a hunter-gatherer, we're hunters, humans are hunters. It's like,
Yes.
no, you're
Sort
not
of-
you're not hunting.
It
You're
sort of
not hunting.
denies 4,000 years of civilization to say that we can have the Sistine Chapel painted and we can create the most extraordinary works of art and we can build the pyramids, about which new news breaking today, the Nile split in half and it was a new branch of the Nile underneath the pyramids. But and you can't control you're using a primal instinct as an excuse to carry out an activity that you know damn well you can control and you should control, because you should be setting an example of compassion and respect to the rest of society. I mean, these are not the quiet, shy, retiring types. These are people who have got $80,000 to go and spend on a safari for 3 weeks in Africa and kill an elephant, plus all the on costs.
Yeah. And I know it's called trophy hunting, but it's not hunting really. You're not out in the wild like the Maasai tribes. They'll hunt a lot, or not so much anymore, but they used to hunt a lion like with their bare hands. You're having an animal brought to you. Are you going to say what Lou Through said?
Yeah, I'm going to say what Lou Through said. Yeah.
Go on.
Lou Through famously did a hunting documentary, and he said it's like playing tennis without a net.
It's like you're getting an animal brought to you.
You get trackers, you got it's not. It's just given to you to do that.
And
well,
it's ridiculous.
and so there's a film. I mean, your viewers, listeners can look it up. It's called Trophy, surprisingly, and I'm in it for a nanosecond because I was told that this was going to be a film that would look at both sides. Would reflect on this and try and find solutions. It never intended to do that, in my opinion, and B, it certainly didn't achieve it. But in it, an American hunter, first of all, he explains his childhood, where his father would admonish him and give him a very bad time psychologically if he didn't kill something. So he was brought up to hunt, and if he'd walked away from that, he would have been given a very bad time by his father. But when he kills the lion in it, he then breaks down in tears and cries to his dead father, seeking atonement, as if this is him proving to his now deceased father that he has been the child that his dad had hoped for all along.
Wow.
Oh boy, there's a ton to unpack, and there's a very good book actually called The Psychology of Trophy Hunting, and that's worth looking up. It's only been out for about 4 years. It's a small book, but it's written by a professor, and I'm trying very hard to remember his name, Jeffrey somebody, a really nice guy who I've met. He used to do, or maybe still does, a lot of the psychological analysis of kidnappers and terrorists.
Oh.
So he's very embedded in alternative psychological worlds and what makes people's brains tick. And he says there's so much of a parallel. Jeffrey Beatty Beatty's his name. There's such a parallel in his view between the psychology that sits in the mind of the trophy hunter and the psychology of the terrorist, the armed robber, the kidnapper. And I just think, okay.
Yeah. I would
I'm not arguing.
I would agree. So as a general rule, before we move on from trophy hunting, let's just say and I hope no one listening to this has this feeling, but if you feel like you need to go and hunt a wild animal, spend your money instead on a really good therapist.
Yeah, or if you really want to get up close and personal, there are so many great companies that can give you the wildlife experience. Shoot with a camera, don't shoot with a gun.
Yeah.
I mean, the last thing on this, the president of the National Rifle Association in America, who's been disgraced now, but very recently, went to Africa to shoot with his wife. They went together. First of all,
Family
the guy
holiday.
can't shoot. I mean, he is literally unable to.
Ironic being the
Yeah.
You'd have
chairman of the
thought.
National
That's
Rifle
weird.
Association.
But secondly, he and others, when they go trophy hunting, how do they trophy hunt? They go with a professional hunter who's standing over their shoulder with a rifle in case they screw up and the animal has to be dispatched. At least that's the theory. And then they also put the sticks in the ground, the rest. So they're not even holding the gun. The gun is sitting
Wow.
on a rest.
They're bowling with
Or
the
they're in a
walls up.
blind, they're in a hide, and there's a dead goat in a tree 20 feet away,
No.
and they wait until the lion, and that's in the film Trophy, reaches up, exposing the flank to get the goat, or I think it's a gazelle actually, and bang, 20 feet away? I mean, seriously?
It's snowplow.
It is hard to comprehend. And maybe we should move on.
It's
Well,
infuriating, isn't
yeah,
it?
I mean, that was what I was going to come on to. Well, obviously, this is emotive stuff. You know, this is, and I can imagine it takes a toll sometimes. You having to see all these things, read about these things, evaluate these things. Do you find that sometimes it can be a lot?
Sure. I mean, it is. You see animals in really awful roadside zoos or in circuses or used and exploited in the pet trade or, body parts. I went out to Kenya when they burnt 100 tons of ivory, and I stood with a couple of friends beside these funeral pyres, 15-foot high, representing, I don't know how many elephants, 16,000 elephants, something like that. And yeah, it can. But you know what I've learned to do, for whether it works for everyone or not, is I get angry and then I get hold of that anger and I massage it and direct it in as positive a way as I possibly can. And I also, with the benefit of having done this for 40 years, is I'm able to look at the long game. So I could look at the UK and say, when I started out, just before I started out, in the late 1970s, and we started in 84, there were 24 dolphin shows in the UK, one of which involved ladies in swimming costumes having those costumes removed by dolphins for the predilection of a certain group of men in London.
Wow.
Yeah, they put fish paste on the costume, that kind of thing.
Oh my God.
And now we have none. When I started out, wasn't on the New Year's Day TV special was a circus special, with the 3-ring circus and a guy with a top hat and a whip and a sparkly coat, and we had the jugglers and we had that, but we also had all the animal acts. That's gone. And there are no wild animals in circuses in the UK anymore. Okay. With the benefit of a long time fighting these. And by the way, that circus, the ending of the use of wild animals in circuses in the UK, I sat on my first government committee on that in 1994, and it came in 2020.
Wow. So
You gotta be
you're in it for the long game. Just before we finish, I would love to ask you, on behalf of all of our listeners, what people can do to make a real difference. And I know you've got various different campaigns through the Born Free Foundation. You've got sort of like selfish selfies and you're campaigning for no more elephants in captivity and stuff like that. Is there anything that people can do, tangible things, or not do, to sort of help with wildlife?
Yeah, I mean, please, the first thing I would say is just go and take a look at the website. We've recently redone it. There's tons of information in the campaign section, in the news section. There's lots of tools that people can access, information that people can access. There are simple things like do go to your nature reserve. We are a densely populated island. Nature is under real pressure in our own backyard. And it would be great if our government, whoever that government is, realized how much people value our own nature and want us to work hard to restore. We're nature depleted. Let's restore nature and do something about it. And in fact, in June, I'm going to be joining hopefully many people in London. We'll be peacefully walking through London, calling for whichever government we end up with to restore nature now. So if you want to join in on that, come in on that, details are on our website. Just come along. Similarly, in August, we have our own thing, Born Free thing, called Walk on the Wild Side. I'm taking a short break at that time, but wherever I'll be doing my 23,000 steps, one for every wild lion living today. That's the estimate. And I'll hopefully get sponsored by people, and that will raise funds. And there's already 60 people signed up to do it. Maybe we can get another 60 or 100 people, and just do that thing you can do. The one thing when people say, what should I not do? And I say, well, the worst thing you can do is to be silent, to sit on your hands and say, I can't really impact this. I can't do anything about it. You absolutely can. You are a champion for wildlife. You speak to your family, you speak to your workmates, you speak to your school colleagues, your teachers. You relentlessly speak up for nature and wildlife, because without you, they have no voice. And we, Born Free, and all our supporters, and everyone who shares our values, you don't have to be a supporter, but everyone who shares our values is the voice for wildlife. And boy, does it need it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Will, thank you so much for coming on.
I feel like I've talked a lot.
It's all been fantastic.
Honestly, it's been really, it's stuff obviously that's very close to my heart anyway, because I do a lot of sort of like conservation type stuff, but it's still, hearing it again is still very emotional and evocative, and especially, like elephants particularly. I think a lot of people, my experience, it seems like a lot of people really love elephants. They're just very, very intelligent and empathetic creatures,
family oriented, and these big tuskers that have been shot on the border, just over the border in Tanzania. I mean, I've probably seen those elephants.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine what goes through the minds of the research team down there at the Amboseli Trust for Elephants. But also, there's a danger that we marginalize the feelings of local communities, because we think of them as other than ourselves. But those elephants and wildlife, that Maasai community across the entire Amboseli ecosystem, which goes over into the border into Tanzania, they have lived for centuries with wildlife. The stories of wildlife are inextricably linked to the stories of those people. They share the same drought. They share the same flood. They share the same habitat. They have rubbed along together for centuries. Don't marginalize the impact that losing those big tuskers will have on the minds of local people.
Yeah, and the community.
It's completely tragic.
It is.